Welcome, everybody.
Here it is, ladies and gentlemen, Father Hines and his great band playing for you from the new Grand Terrace on
Evening,
the
Gene.
Great South Side. Get ready now for 30 minutes of Super Jive in the Father Hines Show.
Hey, Chris.
Yeah.
Oh, glad to have you now, Chris. First tour I've been able to broadcast from my own house in a while, too.
What could this be? It's the Limehouse Blues.
We've been on the road and everything, you know? Hey, Bruce. Hey, Lorena and Kurt. Hey, Becky. Hey, Timothy. Hey, Maria in NYC. Hey, Evelyn. Hey, Ellen, Zuhair, Gregory, Melissa, Anna. Ellen, sorry about the rough week. A lot of that going around. Hey, Betsy and Jay and Eileen and Maria in Miami. Hey, Cindy. Hey, Eric. Pamela, I know. I had to take Ronnie out to Andersonville. I just roasted. Melissa, I heard about the earthquake in Indiana. I heard about people feeling it in Chicago. I didn't feel it where I am. I don't think. Hey, John. Hey, Lakeeger. Hey, Kurt. Hey, Heidi. Hey, Steve. Evening, Karen. Hey, Anna. Hey, Rosemary. Hey, Casey. Hey, Emily. Ah, Karen, that's rough. Hey, James. Evening, Casey. Evening, Amber in Indiana. Did you feel the earthquake? Apparently there was a 3.4 or something. Hey, Mom. I saw you guys were on a Dolphin Tour down there in South Georgia. Apparently there was an earthquake in Indiana that people, at least a neighborhood down from mine, were able to feel. Or had things knocked off of their walls. Okay, mail is getting shut down. So any technical support problems can't help you. Hey, Nancy. Hey, Bridget. Hey, Nancy. Hey, Tracy. Hey, Octavio. Hey, Dad. Oh, and look who has come to join us here. Wow, we haven't done this on a Thursday in a while, huh? We've been on the road so much lately.
That's what you call a powerhouse coder. Yeah, Earl Father Hines carries on now.
I feel like if I'd felt it at all, I would have just thought it was a truck going by. Another firecracker. The fireworks jerks aren't as bad as they were last year, for sure. Hey, Nancy. Hey, Betsy. Hey, Kyle. Yep. And Miles, since we got back from out of town, has been so clingy every time I sit at the desk. He wants to come climb up the back of me. Well, we've been on the road so much lately, we haven't been able to broadcast from home in a bit. Looks like it's really been a minute. Now, Mikhail, I'm not in Indiana. I'm up here in Rogers Park in Chicago, but apparently people in Chicago were feeling it. Hey, Robert. Hey, Carrie. I passed through Indiana a bit, did a couple of times in the last few weeks. Hey, Ellen. Ooh. Miles didn't seem too freaked by anything. So there's that. I remember a kid, there was this rumor of a big earthquake that was supposed to hit Missouri that we were even going to be able to feel in Iowa. And I've looked it up again since then. I remember there was like commercials for insurance for it. And it was all come from like some weird specious reasoning. That one guy had like put together like a timetable or something. Hey, David and Barb. Hey, Amy. Michaela, yeah, West Rogers Park. Hey, Dottie. Hey, Kelly. New Madrid Fault, that was the one. Miles. Miles is continuing to climb up me over here. Hey, Kelly. Hey, Kathy. Maria, I guess it was this afternoon. Hey, Jackie.
Give our faithful seat a slap and carry on in jive. Hi-ho, Silver!
That sounds right. I think it was more like early 90s sometime. Late 80s, early 90s. Hey, Rodney. I just looked up the article I remembered in the Des Moines newspaper. It was like a thing in the kids page that was done as like a gerbil calling his cousins, saying, "You dudes will probably just feel the rumble a bit. Just make sure you dudes have a safety plan." Hey, Kirk. Hey, Aviva. Mona, tonight I am drinking Buffalo Trace. Hey, Lisa. Hey, Sunshine Marianne. Irene, of course. Hey, Laura. Hey, Jan. Aviva, apparently there was an earthquake in Indiana someplace. That many people in Chicago felt. I did not. Hey, Mary. Evening, Sue.
Let's stop and have a little Father Hines melody of the Colorado sunset.
Tom, Buffalo Trace is a good go-to. Hey, Gina. Hey, Robin, down at Animal Kingdom. It's more of a winter bourbon for me, Buffalo Trace, because it's got that spice to it. But it's delicious. And I just froze some mint leaf ice cubes to make mint juleps. It's a good hot weather drink. The hot weather is back with a vengeance. Evening, Ann.
Every blade of grass where I roam.
Evening, Keely. Hey, Rose.
Hand in hand, we'll stand beneath the moon and bid the Colorado sunset good night.
Hey, Kristen. Hey, Linda. We'll give it a couple more minutes for everybody to get logged on. Hey, Rosita and Ashley. Summer camp, I love it. I'll cook the eggs erroneous.
Earl Father Hines gives us a bit of jive under the general heading of So Help Me.
Hey, Dana. Hey, Kathleen. Give it a few more minutes for everybody to get on. Hi, Allison. Mikhail, this is Earl Father Hines live at the Grand Terrace Cafe, also known as the Sunset, down there on 35th. I'm sure we're all singing Don't Go Back to Rockville right now. Alright, but if we're having a summer camp, we're being the scrappy band of misfits. Not the rich kids camp across the lake. That'll get what's coming to them in the end. Hey, Mark. Hey, Cliff. And hey, Miles, look who's back. Oh, Heather, that's awesome. I will see you then. Hey, Nancy. Yes, there is a Mysterian get-together planned for October 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. We don't know what we're doing exactly. I know the 2nd I gotta do some tours for the zoo. You can see Miles is behind us, right behind the camera right now. Miles, have a seat, why don't you? Have a seat. Sit down. There we go. Yeah. Have a seat. I will wait for Earl to finish this tune. It sounds like he's coming up. Hey, Mary in Nashville. Alright, still kind of watching out carefully for Miles. I better grab some toys to throw. Alright, just in case he won't leave me alone, I got some things to distract him with. Hey, Audrey. Everybody, we're giving it just another minute or so for Earl Father Hines to finish this tune. Then we'll get started. Plus, I got the Miles playing with the machine factor tonight. Hey, Ron and Roxy in California on YouTube. Hey, Patty in Bolingbrook. Hey, Bob. And Bob. I've been able to broadcast from home in a couple of weeks, so Miles is glad to be back in the spotlight. All right. Okay. You know, I should have had this up the entire time. Sorry about that. But all right, everybody. Once again, I'm Adam Seltzer from Mysterious Chicago Tours. Welcome along. I've been a tour guide and historian here in Chicago for about 15 years now. I've got about a dozen Chicago history books, including the upcoming book on Graceland Cemetery that'll be out next spring from University of Illinois Press. Others include Flickering Empire, How Chicago Invented the U.S. Film Industry, The Smart Aleck's Guide to American History, H.H. Holmes' The True History of the White City Devil, the subject of 2 upcoming tours, and Mysterious Chicago, the book. I'm pushing all the wrong buttons today. It's going to be one of those nights, I suppose. Mysterious Chicago, the book. All right, everybody. Today we are covering one of my favorite topics to cover, the community of refugee enslaved people who made their way to Chicago and the Underground Railroad, people who worked on it and people who escaped on it, which of course was the loosely connected network of places that people used as safe houses as they made their way away from slavery and up to freedom. A lot of people just stopped when they got to Chicago, others needed to go a little bit further on. Now of course, I'm not the first and last source you should look at for stuff like this. Probably the best source of information out there, I'll put this up for a second, is a book called Black Chicago's First Century by Christopher Robert Reed, who is a professor at Roosevelt University. I've had to go through some of his papers for some of the stories that I've worked on here just to get more information. Gotta say, Professor Reed, your handwriting is even worse than mine. And that's saying something, too. I'll leave that up for just a second here. Black Chicago's First Half Century. But the difficulty with researching these stories is a lot of times they're really just not all that well documented. For instance, there's this terrific one in an 1848 newspaper that talks about an enslaved man named Charlie who escaped to Chicago. And apparently, according to this story that was published in a newspaper in 1848, Charlie lived in Chicago for a while, then wrote back to his enslaver and said, "I'm sorry I escaped. If you'll take me back without punishment, I'll explain to all of the others why it's such a bad idea to escape." And his enslaver wrote back and said, "Yes, sure, all is forgiven, just come and we'll make you useful that way." So he sat everybody down for the big meeting to tell them why they shouldn't escape. and then said, okay, here's how you get away. I really hope that this is a true story, but there's just no way to tell. There's not enough information in this article that we could really tell one way or the other. And just in general, Underground Railroad stuff, they had to be fairly secretive about it. So it's kind of a natural that a lot of the stories don't really survive. But we're trying to dig up as much as we possibly can. Now, we'll start with some of the earlier days in Chicago. We'll kind of go chronologically here. So we'll start in 1832, when a guy named Philo T. Carpenter arrived in Chicago via canoe. He had heard that Chicago, this new and growing city, was a good place for a young apothecary to make his name. Here's a sculpture of him by Laredo Taft. You only got a sculpture by Laredo Taft if you did in fact make a name for yourself. So Philo Carpenter arrived intending to work as a pharmacist, but he happened to arrive right at the same time as the 1832 cholera epidemic. So General Winfield Scott had just arrived on a ship piloted by a guy named Captain Augustus Walker and brought all of his soldiers with him, who brought cholera with them. Eventually 88 people from the crew, plus who knows how many people who were just living around Chicago at the time, caught it. But Carpenter not only survived it, he went on to found one of Chicago's first, if not the first, anti-slavery societies. And Captain Augustus Walker, the guy who had piloted the ship that brought the soldiers here, went on to build his own ship called the Great Western. This was an early steamship. It was one of the first ever to have cabins up on top instead of just down below. But it was also really well known among the community that if you wanted to help people escape, the Great Western was a good ship to do it on. Captain Augustus Walker, the same guy who brought the cholera to Chicago, was really well known as a guy who was perfectly willing to just conveniently not notice that when he sailed out of Chicago, he suddenly had a lot more black crew members than he had had when he arrived in Chicago. He would also conveniently not notice that he had quite a few fewer when he left Detroit, or especially any Canada trip. And he'll come up again over the course of this. Now, the trick with this, though, one of the drawbacks of these stories is that these are both about white guys. It's a common criticism of Underground Railroad stories that most of them tend to center white people who helped, not the people who were actually escaping. They're kind of treated as incidental passengers. And that's true. That's partly just because that's usually who ended up writing down the story in the end. And also, if people successfully escaped, it's quite likely we wouldn't have the story. But there are some exceptions to this, including one over here. Now, down here on the south side, right near what is now Dearborn Station, was the home of a guy by the name of Joseph Henry Hudlin. Now, Joseph Henry Hudlin, who was one of the first frame houses owned by a black man in Chicago, often said to be the first. He's also got a marker in Graceland Cemetery. Move over to a right here. Here's the thing, it says Joseph Hudlin right here, but here's the real trick, this is where it gets really interesting. Joseph Hudlin is not buried in that plot. He's buried in this one, the next plot over, where there's a base for a monument that the family never got around to actually adding. But looking over the burial records, there's a person buried in that plot along with them, or there was someone buried there, eventually moved, named Martha Stevens. And if we go back to the plot where Hudlin's marker is the marker for Mary Ann Stevens. So we can put together what happened here. Martha was her daughter, eventually married a guy named Robert Gray. Apparently, when Mary Ann died, Mr. Hudlin said, well, if you don't have a marker yet, you can bury her in my plot until you have your own plot. So she was buried in the Hudlin plot until they had purchased this one, then moved over a couple of years later. Now, exactly what connections we could have between them, it's difficult to know, but what we do know is that Joseph Hudlin lived quite a life. Now, he was born enslaved in Culpeper, Virginia. There's a number of different stories as to exactly how he escaped. The simplest version is one day he got on a ship pretending that he was a chef. And he just kind of hid out as a chef on board the ship. Nobody thought twice about a guy in a chef's hat. Then when the ship got to Illinois, he just left and made his way to Chicago, where he became the janitor at the Board of Trade. And he held that job for about 45 years. Upon his death, his son took over. Now, this is usually shown whenever they're talking about Joseph Hudlin in the press or on TV. This is usually the photograph that they use, but I've just never been totally convinced that it's him and not his son. There's a lot more pictures of his son, and they all look about like the guy in this picture, including the uniform. But over on the left is a picture of Joseph that was definitely supposed to be senior, that was published in the Chicago Defender years and years after his death, but still it was one identified as him. But Hudlin made his way to Chicago, and in addition to working as a janitor and sheltering fire refugees with his wife, Anna Hudlin, he was working on the Underground Railroad, in particular helping people who were escaping from St. Louis. Now, he had a brother living in Alton, Illinois. People would get across the river to Alton, then Joseph would come down and meet them in Alton and get them the rest of the way up to Chicago. Now, we don't really know who Mary Ann and Martha Stevens were, but we do know that they were a black mother and daughter who came from St. Louis. So it all kind of fits that also the person right next to the Hudlin marker, Willis Montgomery, was a black man born in Kentucky. There's no way to tell for sure, but it's entirely possible that these people who put a marker for Joseph in their plot are people that he helped escape via the Underground Railroad. All of the pieces fit, we just don't really know for sure. We'll move on back into chronological order. Elsewhere downtown, right here at on this spot, right in the loop, was once a building by the name of Chapman's Building. And one day there was a guy by the name of Edwin Heathcock, a black man who was working out at a local farm. One of his rival employees reported him to the overseer as a fugitive slave. And he couldn't prove that he wasn't, so Edwin Heathcock was arrested and put in jail while they advertised, hey, did anyone lose this man? Come get him. But nobody did, so they had to let him go, but there was a rule at the time that if a prisoner couldn't pay for the food and stuff that he had while he was in prison, he could be auctioned into a month or so of indentured servitude. It's not quite the same as the slave auctions that were going on down south, but it was a little too close for anybody's comfort around here. And this started making the news that there was going to be this sale in Chicago. So stuff was plastered all over. The day of the auction, the sheriff looked horribly nervous. A crowd had gathered around, kind of standing like this, just kind of daring anybody to make the bid. Because there was a tight-knit group of abolitionists in Chicago who had worked really hard to make sure that the real prevailing sentiment in the city was an anti-slavery one. So the sheriff tried to do an auction, got towards the end and said, well, if I don't have any bids, I have to just put the man back in jail. So meanwhile, across the street was the office of a guy named Mahlon Ogden. Mahlon Ogden's brother was our first mayor, William Ogden. He looked out the window of his office and said, I bid 2 bits, 25 cents. And that was enough. Nobody else bid, so he came up with his quarter, handed it to the sheriff, and said, all right, Mr. Heathcock, I've bid, I won. I say, go where you like. And with that, he averted a riot for 25 cents. Now, exactly what became of Edwin Heathcock is not known. There was a man by that name who got married in Detroit a few years later, then drifted back to Chicago and joined the Union Army in the 1860s. Whether it's the same Edwin Heathcock is difficult to know for sure. Well, it's impossible to know for sure. But there are two different accounts of what this auction was like. One of them paints Mahlon Ogden as a real villain for even going around participating in it, even legitimizing it. The other paints him as a real hero for averting a riot for 25 cents. And the hell of it is that both of those accounts were written by the same guy. A guy by the name of Zabina Eastman. He was buried over here at Rose Hill Cemetery. Zabina Eastman ran an abolitionist newspaper called The Western Citizen and later The Free West in Chicago. The original newspaper account was the one that made it look like Ogden was being a real jerk just for participating, but later when he reminisced about it, he seems to have changed his mind and thought that Ogden was a real hero after all. It was really interesting going through the microfilm of his old newspaper. One of the things I found in there, one of my favorite finds in the microfilm room ever, was this speech he transcribed of Frederick Douglass in Princeton, Illinois, October 25th, 1853. It was a really good speech. I was reading through it. There were lines like, when a slave is first escaping, he would rather meet a wolf than a Christian. Good line. What I was kind of surprised to find, I took a bunch of pictures of it and found that it has apparently never been reprinted since it was in this newspaper in 1853. So it's up on the Mysterious Chicago page now. If you click on blog and scroll back, I transcribed whatever I could. There were certain sections where the scan just wasn't legible, but I got as much as I could. It's a really interesting speech. We'll switch over to Oakwood Cemetery for a second for one of my very favorite guys to talk about. It's kind of a nondescript grave marker for a guy who was considered one of the most prominent people in town. A guy by the name of Charles Volney Dyer. Charles, one of those songs, one of those names you can sing to the tune of John Wesley Harding. Charles Volney Dyer. Charles Volney Dyer was sometimes, he came to Chicago as a doctor around 1840, but quickly made enough money selling land that he gave up medical practice for a while to focus more on his work on the Underground Railroad. He was sometimes even referred to as the president of the Underground Railroad, which of course was not a formal title, but indicates just how active he was in it. Now, he had an office right across the street from the old City Hall. See, I'm a little bit off center here. Well, right across from the old City Hall, which was also the courthouse and everything, right where City Hall is now. But one day, while he was having his breakfast, one of his clerks came running in and said, "Hey, you know that guy you were helping escape? A bunch of slave catchers from down south have caught him. They've got him over at the Mansion House Hotel right now." So Charles Volney Dyer grabbed his cane and ran to the Mansion House Hotel. Here's the route he would have taken. Of course, he would recognize absolutely zero of these buildings, but it was just really around the corner to get from his place, get to his place to the Mansion House, which would have been right about where the L tracks are now. So he busted into this place, found the room where the slave catchers were. The guy he was helping to escape was tied up, busted in with his cane, and the slave catcher said, "Sir, you are interfering with our domestic institutions." Upon which Dyer held up his cane and said, "Yes, well, you are interfering with my breakfast." Busted the cane over the guy's head, helped the guy escape once again, and then was presented with a brand new cane from the abolitionists in Chicago to replace the one he had busted over a slave catcher's head. How much of that story is true, I wish I knew better. It was reported widely at the time. There's just such an action comedy vibe to it. The quip, "Oh, you are interfering with my breakfast," is just too good to be true. However, the cane story, the fact that he broke his cane and needed a new one, is almost certainly true, because the Chicago History Museum still has the second cane that was presented to him in its files. It's not usually kept on display, but I've been trying to get him to get it out and put it on display for a while now. There was a couple of talks about it. It was a well-known story in Chicago, even through the 1880s. There was this article, "The Presentation to the Historical Society of Dr. Dyer's Famous Anti-Slavery Cane," which they still have. Now, not too far from his office would have been the office of... Quick check what we got here. LCP and Mrs. Freer. Now, he was a lawyer who worked downtown, was part of the tight-knit group of abolitionist communities, and one of the last ones to die. He lived well into the 1890s, so he was still around to tell stories for a long time. One time, an Inter-Ocean reporter asked him, "So, did the anti-slavery men of Chicago believe in compromise?" And he said, "No, they believed in war." We'll also move his law partner. Now, his grave at Graceland would have been right there on the left. But his law partner was a bit more warlike about the whole issue than he was even. Right up on the corner here. Move there around to it. But this was his law partner, James H. Collins. And I've never been able to find even a drawing of James H. Collins, which is kind of surprising because he was a very prominent lawyer at the time, and particularly known for being a really combative abolitionist. He would even run for office as a third-party candidate because neither of the major parties at the time were sufficiently anti-slavery for him. So one day in 1846, 3 men were arrested as possible refugee slaves in Chicago and taken to Judge Kercheval's office, which would have been right about here, right near the river in the Loop. And this actually became national news that 3 people had been arrested. So Freer, as well as people like Charles Volney Dyer, Mr. Owen Lovejoy, LCP Freer, and Charles Volney Dyer all got together and argued these 3 men's case before Judge Kercheval while a crowd waited around outside. But really, while they were talking, they were just really creating a distraction. because while they were talking, a couple of other people down below helped the three men escape, got them into the crowd, and hustled them out to safety. By the time they got away, they were able to convince Judge Kercheval that nobody has any right to arrest fugitive slaves in Chicago anyway, so the whole case was moot. The next day, Collins had a particularly good quote. He said, "No officer, while engaged in the arrest, detention, or surrender of a fugitive slave, can claim any greater protection from the law than any private person who may be mean and vile enough to engage in such an employment. And any officer thus employed is entitled to the same respect, and no more, as should be given to the base and mercenary slave catcher." In other words, any police officer who was trying to arrest a person as a possible, was what they would have called a fugitive slave at the time, was essentially just a kidnapper, and it was okay to attack them. Now, the arresting officer in this case was a guy by the name of Henry Rhines, and really, we can divide cases like this in Chicago into two categories. One where we don't know the name of the arresting officer, and one where the arresting officer was a guy named Henry Rhines. He comes up in all of these stories. He was a grocer by trade, but lived right about here at Randolph and LaSalle, and is currently at Graceland Cemetery. He would have originally been in the Old City Cemetery, but now he's right almost exactly the opposite side from James H. Collins. It's not a picture of him going around, but there is a picture of his son, Henry Jr., also known as Dump Rhines, who was a famous billiard player. But really just about every other case of this, and Graceland definitely does not mind when I dance on people's graves for this sort of reason. I was running out of dance moves by the time I got to Henry Rhines, so it's really just just the hand jive. But there's many stories about him. I'll just try to work them in as we go, really. So, here's some water. This is actually quite a bit north of where this would have actually happened. It would have actually happened probably a little east of where Navy Pier is now. Or pretty close to the London Guarantee building, really. But I mentioned earlier the ship the Great Western that was only too happy to conveniently not notice that there were more black people on board when they left Chicago than there had been when they arrived. So there's a particularly good story that one day in 1844, Captain Augustus Walker was about to sail away when Henry Rhines came marching up to him and said, "Do you realize that there are 4 escaping slaves on board your ship?" And Captain Walker looked at him and said, "Are you an officer?" Because at the time, we had a different mayor every year. So every year the police department would be shaken up. And the police department at the time consisted of a sheriff and like 3 deputies. But they were different every year. And this was a year that Henry Rhines was not on the force. So Captain Walker asked him, "Are you an officer?" And Mr. Rhines had to admit that no, he was not. So Walker said, "Well, then you must just be a damned rascal." And away he sailed, while people like Charles Volney, Dyer, and Philo Carpenter were specifically named as cheering on the shore the entire time. Another person mentioned as working with the Great Western quite a bit, the guy I've been wanting to add to this, was a guy who had an office right where the Thompson Center is now. His wasn't a lawyer's office, he was a barber by trade. But right about where the Thompson Center is now, this would be right across the corner from Charles Volney Dyer's office, right across the street from LCP Freer's office. But at the time, as of the 1840s and 1850s, this was the site of a hotel known as the Sherman House. And on the first floor of the Sherman House was the office of a guy by the name of Louis Isbell, who later in his life would claim to be the first black man to settle in Illinois or even in Chicago. He was neither of the above, really, but he came here fairly young in the 1830s, certainly one of the first to arrive here after Chicago became officially a city. Now, his early life, there's a lot of conflicting reports on. Apparently, he didn't like to talk about it much. By most accounts, he was born enslaved, but then was freed at a fairly young age. In any case, when he was a young man, he made his way to Chicago, got involved in a lot of anti-slavery committees while working as a barber. As an old man, he had lots and lots of stories to tell about how he had cut the hair of people like Long John Wentworth, Abraham Lincoln, pretty much every prominent person. It's kind of hard sometimes to tell how many of his stories are true and how many are just old man stories. But one of his big ones was that he claimed that Abraham Lincoln had gotten him involved in recruiting black soldiers for the Civil War. after black soldiers started to be recruited in 1863. Now, later on in his life, he would try to get a pension from the Army because of his services here. They turned him down because he wasn't officially a member of the Army at the time, even if Lincoln had asked him to be. But his services in that field were really well documented. Like, here's one from 1863 when he was rounding people up to volunteer for armies that were being formed in Massachusetts. And it says here, 250 have been contributed from Illinois. A squad of 33 enlisted by Lewis Isbell, you always had to mention the race here, went east on Saturday. The same recruiting agent had sent 100 previously. And this is just when the only place that was recruiting was Massachusetts. It mentions elsewhere in the article, one of the problems he was having was a lot of people were waiting because they knew that pretty soon Illinois was going to start recruiting as well. Which they did. They recruited the United States Colored Troops 29th Regiment here, and Lewis Isbell continued working without pay. Now, you might remember one of the morning mini tours lately, we went down to Mount Olivet Cemetery and were able to kind of plot out where his grave was there, because they've got a search feature. It appears to be unmarked. Now, once again, he wasn't officially employed by the Army. Given restrictions at the time, he couldn't have been. I wrote to my senator today to see if she can prevail on the military to give him a military headstone. I feel like they should. This is the kind of thing you often have to make noise about this kind of thing for years before it'll happen. We'll move up to the late 1840s here. But we'll hear from Isbell again. One other one, a guy who comes up on an awful lot of tours around here, is this guy who has a memorial boulder in Lincoln Park named David Kennison. Now, David Kennison claimed that he was the last surviving member of the Boston Tea Party, and was absolutely lying through his teeth at the time. And I suspect Chicagoans of the day kind of knew it, but they kept him around, partly because they thought it was cool to have a Revolutionary War soldier in town, so don't ask questions, but also because he was a really outspoken abolitionist. There were a lot of stories about him showing up at, like, Free Soil meetings and giving really long speeches. Like this one here, the old man closed his speech with the word, "Make your country free and abolish slavery." But then 1850 happened. 1850, they passed the Fugitive Slave Law in Congress. Now, before that, we had been saying, people like James H. Collins had said, we're under no obligation to follow these rules here in Chicago. But then, when the Fugitive Slave Law passed, the official law was, yes, places like Chicago are required to help slave catchers out. So naturally, there were lots of meetings about this, including up here at the old City Hall, the version of City Hall that stood in 1850, right in the middle of State Street. It's kind of hard to picture the thing properly. But there were an awful lot of meetings here. James Collins typically had the best line of the night. He said, "Political death and damnation to all who aided in the passage of this infernal law, and to the bad base men who cowardly sneaked from the vote on its final passage." But it was announced at this meeting that whatever Congress said, Chicago police officers would not be required to help slave catchers. We were what we would now call a sanctuary city. Meanwhile, there was a group of what would then be referred to as the colored citizens of Chicago, who passed a resolution saying, "In the language of the father of this country, General Washington, resistance to tyrants is obedience to God. We will stand by our liberty at the expense of our lives and will not consent to be taken into slavery, nor permit our brethren to be taken." So Chicago was ready for a fight here. But of course, it's easier to fight things in the court than it is to fight them with fists, at least theoretically. So right here at Jackson in Michigan, in what would have been just the beach at the time, there was a mansion right where the CVS now stands, that was the home of a judge named George Manier, lived here with his wife Anne Manier. And his son, George Jr., had strong memories of them helping people who were escaping to Canada get dressed in new suits of clothes. So essentially, Jackson in Michigan was a stop on the Underground Railroad. Now, in 1851, we had one of our periodic excitements when a man named Moses Johnson was arrested as a possible fugitive slave. So they held a trial in the Saloon Building, which was just on the other side of the Thompson Center, down here on Lake Street. But in the Saloon Building, Manier came up with a different way about it. He noticed that the way that the law was written. Now, really, it was remarkably easy to kidnap people under this law. A man from down south just had to come up to Chicago, see a black man with a weird scar on his face, then go back home and say, I had a slave runaway, he had a weird scar on his face, then get a warrant, go up and take the guy into slavery. So, Manier went in front of the jury, sat down with Moses Johnson in the defendant's box, was able to at least get a trial for him, which was kind of tricky in those days. But he said, now I have here the warrant. It says that this man has lost a copper-colored man named Moses Johnson. Now here before you, you see this Moses Johnson. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, is this man copper-colored? This led to a long, long debate over exactly how the guy should have been described. This was dehumanizing and problematic in many ways, but it worked. The jury decided that no, this guy didn't match the description and therefore could not be arrested. There's one other interesting incident that happened while it was going on, is to guard the space, they had Henry Rhines, the slave catcher, guarding Moses Johnson while he was locked up. But he got drunk overnight and ended up guarding the place next door instead. So the guy who lived next door came stumbling home, and Rhines pulled out his gun and said, nobody passes here without the password. And the guy said, no, man, I live here. Ryan said, nobody passes without the password. Say the password or I'll shoot. So the guy said, okay, what's the password? Upon which Ryan said, Fillmore. Say Fillmore or I'll shoot you. At which point the guy said Fillmore and was allowed to pass. This was reported the very next day. It's another one of those stories that's just too good to be true. It's got such a Bugs Bunny quality to it. In fact, the exact same thing happens in a Marx Brothers movie, but it's another one that I really hope is true. Now, by this time, Henry Rhines was not long for this earth. He would get sick and die a couple of years later. But he was almost a fugitive himself. A few years before, he had shot a tavern keeper to death, was put in jail, escaped to New Orleans, captured there and brought back, and then apparently the whole thing blew over. I haven't been able to figure out how the hell that happened yet, but 2 years later, he was back at work guarding Moses Johnson. Another 2 years went by. And there was a market hall where the old criminal court building now stands. This is like generations of and fires worth of things that have been replaced on this site. But in 1854, Congress introduced the Nebraska Kansas Act, which decided that these new territories of Nebraska and Kansas could decide for themselves whether to be slave states or not. Before that, they had been gone with the Missouri rule that states below the southern border of Missouri were slave states, states north of it were not. Now it was going to be up to a vote everywhere they went. The big sponsor of this was Stephen A. Douglas, the other half of the Lincoln-Douglas debates a few years later. And to Chicago's credit, when he came here to make this speech, he met with a very hostile crowd. There was a terrific reminiscence of it later on. The gas was turned down at the bottom here. The gas was turned off, and nearly everybody got another man's hat. They threw rotten eggs, chips, and other things at the little giant, as they called Stephen Douglas at the time. Now, meanwhile, Stephen Douglas was waving around some letter saying that people were threatening to attack him, saying, all you people who are supposed to be so tolerant are also sending me letters saying you're going to attack me if I speak. The press said it is needless to say that no such letter was ever written, at least by any reliable person here. He then went around to denouncing the black race tremendously, and then, having gotten away from the speech, went to see Louis Isbell to get his hair cut. And as soon as he stepped in, Douglas, according to Isbell later, seemed kind of sheepish and said, I suppose you're mad at me if you saw my speech. And Isbell said, yes, I did not like what you said. And that's about as much as he was willing to admit when he told the story years later. But right around the same time, there was just a block or two away was a neighborhood called the Sands. Now, having introduced the Nebraska Kansas Act, things were not going to go smoothly. Armies were formed to make sure that that Kansas in particular would become a slave state by any means necessary. A couple of blocks north was the Sands, and when the battles started heating up, there was even this article in the Springfield newspaper. We were favored on Thursday with the sight of the class of men the agitation managers are sending to battle for freedom. 75 drunk rowdies from the Sands of Chicago passed through our town, accompanied with a quota of, a racial slur, on their way to Kansas. This gang of bawdy house bullies were uniformed like a crew of pirates, as the character is generally depicted on the boards of the city theaters. As these fellows supposed they had engaged in a piratical campaign, they deemed it necessary to dress the character, a more ruffianly-looking gang we have never seen before. The Springfield paper was really conservative and would continue to be all throughout the war. But meanwhile, up at Graceland Cemetery, one of the hilltop vaults that comes up on a lot of tours, is Horace White, who would later be the editor of the Chicago Tribune, and at this time got into a bit of trouble. He would have been working on arming the people from the Kansas Act, and including sending a whole box of guns to John Brown, who a few years later would start his famous campaign to organize a slave uprising and rebellion. One of his friends in Chicago was another guy at Graceland, just about within sight of Horace White, named Jon Jones. Now, Jon Jones was the first black man to get rich in Chicago. And he and his wife, Mary Richardson Jones, first lived right where I now park when I'm downtown to do some of my walking tours. Then later moved a little down to Plymouth and 9th. But he was a tailor and cleaner by trade and made an absolute fortune at it. Down a bit. And once he had amassed his fortune, he was even known to place ads like this in Frederick Douglass's newspaper that effectively said, hey, if you've escaped, get to Chicago and come to me. I'll hook you up with a job, I'll loan you some money, etc. Here's some names of other people, such as LCP Freer. George Manier is mentioned there specifically. Now, he and LCP Freer at one point even teamed up to buy a man named Alfred Petit, who may have been a brother of his wife. Now, this was not considered an ideal situation. Abolitionists didn't like just buying people's freedom because it acknowledged the institution existed, but it worked in a pinch. John is known to have done it once or twice, and the same document that bought him also granted him his freedom. But kind of unusually, we actually have pictures of these two as well. But Mary outlived John considerably, so she was able to tell a lot more stories about this thing over the course of the years. The one she had to tell the most was the day that John Brown showed up. One day they were in their house here at 9th and Plymouth when there was a knock on the door and what Mary described as John Brown and 20 or 30 of his fighters. And she thought these guys looked like the scariest bunch of guys she had ever seen in her life and said, I don't know if I want these people hanging around in my kitchen. But John said, well, what else are they supposed to do? You hide them out here, and I'll go get some money to help get them to Canada. So that's what she did. She hid them out and even sent somebody to Upstate Street who looked to be about John's size to be measured for a new suit. And when the rebellion didn't go as planned, John ended up being hanged in that very suit that she had purchased for him. Now, you see a lot when there's a lot of like one-page articles about John and Mary Jones that are still going around today. They usually say that they didn't approve of what John Brown was doing, attempting to kill enslavers and start a rebellion. If you read their own comments on it, it's not so much that they didn't approve, they just didn't think it would work. They didn't seem to have a problem with his plans to do it. But while they were hiding out in the Jones house, what John did was run up to see Allan Pinkerton, who had come to Chicago specifically to work on the Underground Railroad. Later on, his company of detectives would be better known for busting up organized labor, which rather sullies his reputation. But he came here to work for the Underground Railroad. He was described as the irascible and indefatigable Allan Pinkerton, and actually picked up his skills as a detective by trying to rescue people. Meanwhile, for today's morning mini tour, we went to an unmarked space in Graceland. Another one that I think we should probably be able to get a military marker for was a guy by the name of Seth Payne. That's him on the left. Now, Seth Payne in Chicago in the 1840s had been operating a wildcat bank, a bank that operated on its own rules and issued its own currency. But what was unusual about it, there were a lot of wildcat banks, but his was a spiritualist bank, which employed spirit mediums who would talk to the spirits of Alexander Hamilton and George Washington to see who should get a loan and who shouldn't. One newspaper described it as a man to whom all of the isms stuck like burrs in sheep wool. He was into vegetarianism, feminism, all of these things way back before they were popular. But of course, one of the others was abolitionism. In the 1850s, he was a frequent contributor to Sabina Eastman's newspapers, took to growing a long beard about 10 years before it was fashionable, and also by some accounts walking around in robes. So he would have looked like this abolitionist wizard of Chicago walking around. He had a building called the Stable of Humanity in Lake Zurich, where the Marathon gas station is now in Lake Zurich. Now, underneath that gas station, they found some old compartments from the building. The building at the time was kind of like a hippie commune by 1850s edition. But whether these were actually compartments used for the Underground Railroad is kind of unknown. It's possible that they were, but really I think if he was helping people escape through Lake Zurich, he probably just had them hanging out in regular rooms with everybody else. But elsewhere in the cemetery on the north end is a judge by the name of Isaac Newton-Arnold. I started this one a little too far away from it. Let me zip up. This rusticated monument. Isaac Newton-Arnold would go on in Congress to be the first man to introduce a bill that would have outlawed slavery outright. It was a couple months too early, but it helped lay the groundwork for the 13th Amendment that was introduced a couple of months later. And just up the hill from him is his law partner, a guy by the name of E.C. Larned. And these were both guys who were well known for working on abolitionist cases around Chicago. In particular, Larned made a speech against the Fugitive Slave Law when it was introduced in 1850 that was reprinted for years. Then in 1860, a guy was captured and held in Ottawa, Illinois, about 75 miles west of Chicago. Then rescued again by a guy named John Hossack and a couple of his friends, who got into Chicago, where Philo Carpenter got him onto a ship that sailed him off to safety, but not before people like John Hossack could be arrested. And by then, they couldn't really argue against this the Fugitive Slave Law in court very well anymore. By 1860, it was getting a lot stronger. But Larned came up and made a speech against it anyway. And the Judge Drummond, who was buried like 10 feet from where these guys are, had no choice but to find John Hossack guilty. But he gave him leave to make an hour-and-a-half long speech, then gave him like a one-day sentence. And it ended up being, but I believe his sentence is still actually on the books. He has never been pardoned for it. Whereas a couple of guys elsewhere at Graceland, Samuel and Julius Willard, were arrested as people for assisting a fugitive slave and were only just pardoned by Governor Quinn a few years back. They had helped one person successfully, one person unsuccessfully. And they actually wrote a narrative of their time there, too. The spelling in it is interesting. And I thought initially reading it, it was just weird old-timey spelling, or maybe they just really sucked at spelling. But in the Free West newspaper that Sabina Eastman published, there are actually quite a number of letters from the Willards about simplified spelling. They were really into spelling reform. It's one of those causes that you still hear about occasionally, but just never seem to catch on. But one more, we're getting right about to where the Civil War began now, and things changed tremendously. But right around down here was a house of ill fame, let us say, that employed a woman named Eliza Grayson. And Eliza Grayson worked as a domestic in the place, not as one of the workers, but she was talking a little too freely with the workers and happened to mention that she had run away from being enslaved in Nebraska. So that would have made her herself. There weren't that many enslaved people in the Nebraska territory. So they were able to contact her enslaver, a guy by the name of Stephen Knuckles, and say, okay, we've got Eliza here. Come give us a reward and we'll let you take her back. So word of this got around, and when Stephen Knuckles came to arrest her again, a guy named Calvin DeWolf got wind of the whole thing, got everybody together, and arranged for both Eliza and Stephen Knuckles to be arrested and taken to the armory, which stood right where the Sears Tower is now. So while they were thus locked up, really what they were doing was allowing Eliza to escape. Once the crowd had died down, they got her out while Stephen Knuckles was still locked up. She escaped and was not heard from again. However, just yesterday, you might have seen that the governor of Nebraska made this whole big speech about how we shouldn't teach about racism. It was never really a thing at all. To this day, there was a park named after Stephen Knuckles in Nebraska, so the governor of Nebraska, frankly, can just shove it up his ass. But once Lincoln was elected president, the southern states started saying they were going to secede, as they had been threatening to for some times. People like the deputy sheriff and the marshal in Chicago decided the best thing to do was show them that we were serious and we were going to handle the fugitive slave cases after all. This did not sit well with people like LCP Freer. James Coolidge had died in a cholera epidemic 6 years ago by then. So he got together with people like Jon Jones and put an ad in the paper about his office saying to the old Liberty Guard, "The new United States Marshal is inaugurating a reign of terror among our colored population. Do you wish to take any steps in the matter? If you do, you are invited to meet at my office this Friday evening at 7:30 number 51 Clark Street. None but live men are invited." Love the way he phrased that. So what these guys did was got together and arranged for a lot of people who no longer felt safe in Chicago as the marshals started cracking down to meet up at Quinn Chapel, where they were able to get them all on trains to Canada, at least for a little while. That gets me a little bit over time, so I'm going to move on to the closing and plug the upcoming events. But that gets us up to the Civil War. What went on during the Civil War is a whole other thing in Chicago, as we started having what was referred to as contrabands coming into the city, and people like Louis Isbell forming committees to help aid them. But then there were people like buried out behind eternal silence are a couple of guys named Gill and Jackson, who fought for the 116th Colored Regiment in Kentucky, ended up buried at Graceland. They are pictured somewhere in this group photo. It didn't list individually who these people were, but Harris and Gill Jackson and Gill are probably among them. They're among the people we're trying to get markers for at Graceland. There was also a guy named William Randall who fought for the U.S. 29th out of Chicago. The 116th served right along with the 29th from Chicago. These guys were actually present at Appomattox when Lee surrendered in 1865. But that's just really a fraction of what we've got on this stuff. I love finding these stories. They're some of the most important stories in Chicago history, and so many of them are just buried, but they're still out there and they can still be found. So a quick plug for some upcoming things. As a supplement to this, and including some things that didn't make it into tonight, Saturday morning we'll be doing an Underground Railroad tour at Graceland Cemetery. This one does involve a little bit more walking. I've never done this one in person before for that reason. These guys are scattered around all over the cemetery. So this one's kind of an experiment. We don't know how long this one is going to take, but it's going to be a really interesting tour, and the weather's supposed to be a little bit better in Chicago this Saturday morning. So tickets are still available for that. Just go to mysteriouschicago.com or check the events page. Sunday morning, we'll be back here for a virtual tour of River North that I call Mansions and Mysteries. I know that one's Father's Day, so I got a lot to compete with, but we'll see how it goes. Thursday night is a variation on my H.H. Holmes tour called Victims of H.H. Holmes. This is one that I've only done once before, I think, way back in September. So after 10 months, we're breaking that one back out again as a prelude to next Saturday's in-person tour, which will be H.H. Holmes, The Devil Downtown. This was one of my most popular walking tours from the before times. I'm excited to bring this one back. You can find more information on all of these things at mysteriouschicago.com. And of course, if you need a Mysterious Chicago t-shirt, sweatshirt, hoodie, etc., or a Dead Ringer shirt, the Barbershop Quartet from our Time Travel Pub Crawls, just go to cafepress.com/mysteriouschicago. They will hook you up with everything that you need. You can be cool like these people are, like these fine Georgia voters. And with that, everybody, we'll put Earl Father Hines back on, and I'll just hang out in the comments like we always do. So thanks a lot for joining me. I'm Adam Seltzer from Mysterious Chicago Tours. Here's Earl. Barbara, I've had the same cough for about 25 years. But the problem is, once I start talking on some of these things, I end up coughing the same gunk up over and over again. All I can do is swallow it back down, and then I gotta cough it up again. Lee, I don't think I have nearly enough information for a book on it yet, but I'd have to find somebody to work with on it. Thanks, Marita. Thanks, Gene. Sue, I'm on Singular right now. Which has been helping a bit, but today it wasn't doing the job. I was out in Andersonville just a couple hours ago, and I don't think I've recovered yet. Adam, I hear you. Kicked my butt, too. Thanks, Jordana. Mikhail asks, how do I find all those old articles? Mostly it's keyword searches, but once I find one story in like the Tribune, I can go look at all the other papers from the same time period and check the dates. Really, it's just a matter with the dates. Thanks, Joan. Thanks, glad to have you back, Sandy. Yeah, the dust is just kicking my butt lately. Mary, no, I've never done a full one of just the Civil War graves at Rose Hill. I've got notes for a Civil War Rose Hill tour, but I never quite put it all together. Do I have a photographic memory? I wish. I'm good at some things, not others, for memory. How I remember all of this stuff, I don't really know. Sunshine, I don't think we'll be doing a virtual version of it on Saturday. Thanks, Trish. Thanks, Eleanor. Thanks, Aaron in St. Petersburg. Carol asked, did Lincoln spend time in Chicago? Yeah, he spent quite a bit of time in Chicago. I think it's calculated he came about 15 times over the years, something like that. Thanks, Nancy. How did I get interested in giving tours? I kind of fell into it, honestly. Now, where did Miles get to? Here's Miles. Miles! Here, hop up, buddy. Yeah, George, Mr. Pullman, considering it's called the Underground Railroad, there weren't a whole lot of trains in here, were they? Were there? It was neither underground nor a railroad. Now here's the boy himself. Since we were gone for a few days, Miles has been awfully clingy. Gary, yeah, I actually, I emailed Senator Duckworth today. So, no, I don't think I ever spoke to my high school guidance counselor. They gave us the aptitude test and it said acrobat or safety helmet designer. Jennifer, yes, he does. Say something, Miles. Show me how you jump.
we're about halfway through this jive concert by Earl Father Hines and his orchestra, so now it can be told it's reaching you from the new Grand Terrace on your
Miles wants to play all the time lately.
gaily dancing here in the cool atmosphere for this jive of Earl Father Hines. Yeah, but now comes Leroy Harris to sing Now It Can Be Told.
Stay well, Eleanor. Vivian, you know, we've talked about getting him a harness or something, but the problem is I don't want him to get the idea that he's allowed to go outside. If I go out to dinner, do people know who I am? Nah. Every now and then I have been spotted on the street. That's always amusing. Is it difficult to verify if a location was part of the Underground Railroad? Yes. There's all the time people find like a hidden compartment in a basement and assume it must have been the Underground Railroad. But unless somebody wrote down that they were using it like that at the time, all we can really do is speculate. Christy suggests I go down to Jekyll Island to do the Dolphin Tours. I don't know, there's just not a lot in the microfilm room about the Dolphins, I guess. Unless I got to know them all personally and found out, here's a Dolphin who was involved in a sex scandal. Do any of these Dolphins murder anybody or get involved in some sensational case? Oh yeah, Kathleen, we've always had Miles inside. Miles has never been an outdoor cat. We live in a crowded neighborhood here. It's not really conducive. Now, Sarah, usually they'll turn out to be like root cellars or something. Because usually the easiest thing if you were hiding somebody was they would just be in your living room. It would only really be serious emergencies that you'd really need a special compartment to hide somebody. You know, there was a King of the Hill episode about a dolphin sex scandal. Megan, have a good trip. Stay spooky, Sue.
Number 8 on our program of dancing, a tune titled, melodically, A Little Kiss at Twilight.
Carol, of course, national holiday for Juneteenth signed today. This kind of seems like a token gesture, but it's a good token gesture. And it's about time. I grew up not knowing a thing about Juneteenth. I just asked Ronnie today. She didn't know about it either. And I had the curriculum, as I remember it at my school, was really pretty diverse. When people ask, like, when was the first time you read about or heard about, etc., or when it was the first time you heard about this in school, I usually win. But that one I didn't know. But Juneteenth refers to the day when people who were enslaved in Galveston finally found out that they were free now, several months after it happened. There is actually a person at Graceland Cemetery who was enslaved in Galveston. She was just a kid at the time, but she's probably one of the people who found out she was free on Juneteenth. And her family plot is marked, but she doesn't have an individual one yet. Miles is back up here now. They weren't the last to find out either. There was not too far away from the woman in question is General William Emerson Strong of the Freedmen's Bureau.
You'll hear that famous 7 brands of Earl Hines in Vampino.
Who found out that who was still finding people months after that who still hadn't heard south of the Trinity River in Texas. Thanks, Kelly. Oh yeah, Leopold the Great Dane last week. Have a good night, Bob. That's my good Miles. Have you all got your tickets for the Bob Dylan live stream next month? I'm so excited. It's a Bob Dylan concert, his first in over a year, and I'll be in bed at a reasonable hour because it starts at 4. Loving it. Hey, no one over on YouTube. Now, if you're just showing up now, the tour was actually at 8 Central. So now we're just kind of hanging out afterwards. But as soon as we're done hanging out, after just a few minutes, it'll be up on the videos section of the Facebook page. On the one hand, I wouldn't want to see Juneteenth commercialized. On the other hand, I'm not picky about why mattresses go on sale. The irony of it is that it's mostly going to be white people getting the day off.
But here's rhythm and time, Earl Father Hines and the St. Louis Blues.
There's a lot of concerts I'm interested in seeing in September, but I don't know what the schedule's going to be like when because Aiden's moving in and stuff, so I'm reluctant to buy any tickets yet. But the Dylan live stream next month, I am so there. Lee, I haven't heard anything new about the Graceland book in a couple of weeks, but it's still, as far as I know, on track for spring. Whoa, Sarah, that's a thing. I'll be in Minneapolis for a day or two next month. Doing some talking head work. Good night, Joanne. Lee, Judas Priest is on the list of ones I would like to see. And Aiden would love to see it. Aiden's a big Judas Priest fan. We got to figure out what his schedule is first. Hey, I'm thinking of redoing the Tiki time travel pub crawl this July. I'll get different performers and stuff. But now that actual pubs are open, I'm not sure how well time travel pub crawls are going to go. Just overall, our numbers are certainly down here. So we're still trying to figure out how we're transitioning now. But I was really glad the Dylan concert doesn't interfere with any of my scheduled times. Dylan concerts are my favorite sport. I read the set list the day after the concert the way some people read, like, the box scores. Carrie, I haven't seen Loki yet, but I will soon. I finally saw Mayor of Easttown this week. Christine Schuck. Grandma, what was it like? An in-person pub crawl? Maybe. I've never really enjoyed running in-person pub crawls that much. Not nearly as much as I like the time travel ones, the virtual ones. Dean, Dylan is playing a virtual live stream under the title Shadow Kingdom, which could mean anything. We're speculating about that like crazy. But it'll be on a website called Veeps July 18th. But it's live stream only. We don't know if there's going to be a studio audience or what. This is probably a prelude to a fall tour. I hope it's a prelude to a fall tour. I gotta rewind the Earl here. Pedway pub crawl. There's not a lot of pubs in the Pedway. The trick is getting access to it can be a little bit unpredictable. Also, on any given weekend when I'm doing a Pedway tour, there's always at least one branch that smells like diarrhea. Yeah, oh yeah, Find a Great Fridays tomorrow. Totally slipped my mind. I'll find somebody. So yeah, Alex, I might have to go for an easy one tomorrow, as I think it's going to be really hot. Good night, Sandy. Yeah, it won't be a Waldheim.
corn, every blade of grass where I roam. Whisper as I pass every home, hand in hand.
Keely, the Pedway is a series of underground tunnels underneath the city that people can use to walk from place to place. It's very poorly signed, you kind of have to know that it's there, but also down below you'll find like the occasional barber shop and stuff. Mostly it just looks like you're in an airport.
With a bow from Leroy Harris for the words, we turn on now to the next tune. Earl Father Hines gives us a bit of jive under the general heading of So Help Me.
Edibles, that sounds like a good idea tonight. Miles. There we go. Miles has tried to climb my butt. Anyone your chin scratched? Chinny chin chin? There you go. Alright, everybody, I think Miles wants to go chase things around a little bit, so I better indulge him. So, quick plug once again for the upcoming events. That'd be Saturday morning. Last I checked, there were still some tickets available for the Graceland Cemetery Underground Railroad walking tour. That one is in person. Virtual on Sunday with River North Mansions and Mysteries. And Thursday night, bringing back one of Miles. You hit the tile. Victims of H.H. Holmes, a variation on the Holmes tour that just focuses on biographies of each of his known victims. And then next Saturday, the walking tour in person will be H.H. Holmes, The Devil Downtown, tracing Holmes' career through buildings to which he can actually be traced in downtown Chicago. But all right, everybody, in the meantime, thanks a lot for joining me. I'm Adam Seltzer from Mysterious Chicago Tours. I will see you in the morning for Find a Grave Friday at 10 o'clock Central. Till then, I'm Adam saying stay safe, stay strong. Try not to stay too dry or too warm. We got issues with both of those. But stay hungry and stay spooky. Have a good night, everybody.